Their crime is sacrilege, sire. They laid hands on the sacred person of Pharaoh.
Come closer.
Sire, he must die. He laid hands on you.
The ancient Egyptians didn't have police. They had something much worse. Picture this. Steal a fish from the market and you might lose your nose. That's not a joke or a legend. It was the actual punishment for a petty thief. They wanted everyone to remember what happened when you broke the rules. Instead of modern police, they had temple guards who worked for the gods and village elders who could decide your fate on the spot. But these harsh punishments weren't just about keeping people in line. It all traces back to Ma'at, the goddess of cosmic balance. To Egyptians, every theft threatened the universe. Ma'at's balance was everything. Imagine living in a world where swiping a loaf of bread wasn't just petty crime, it was cosmic sabotage. Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order, wasn't some distant idea. She was the reason the sun rose, the Nile flooded, and society didn't collapse into chaos. If you broke her rules, you didn't just get a slap on the wrist, you became a problem for the entire universe. Here's how it worked. Ma'at meant perfect, unchanging order, life, death, and the steady pulse of the Nile. The pharaoh's main job was to keep that order running smoothly. So if you broke a law, you weren't just a criminal. You were a threat to the balance that held everything together. Think about it. Stealing a fish from the riverbank market stalls wasn't just about hunger or greed. In the Egyptian mind, it was a crack in the world's foundation. And the punishments matched the crime's cosmic weight. Temple walls and ancient texts are full of warnings. Disturb Ma'at, and chaos follows. That's why consequences were so brutal and so public. Take the fish thief. Instead of a fine, he might lose his nose, a permanent sign that he'd messed with the god's order. It wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It was about showing everyone else what happened when you threatened Ma'at. New Kingdom court papyri tell us how far this went. A merchant caught cheating customers could lose a hand as a living warning. The missing hand wasn't just punishment, it was a message. Every time someone saw him, they remembered, break the rules and the gods will break you. Even admitting guilt only shaved a few marks off your sentence. Balance had to be restored, no matter how sorry you were. It went beyond theft. Even grumbling at your boss could land you before temple judges. Social insults counted as cosmic crimes. Hierarchy and respect were baked into Ma'at. Upset the social order, and you risked unraveling the universe. Ostraca, those pottery shards ancient Egyptians scribbled on, show workers beaten for complaining, not because it slowed work, but because complaining itself was dangerous. The process for justice was just as tied to the gods. If a farmer was suspected of watering down his grain sales, the first step wasn't a trial. The local priest might consult dreams or watch for signs in the flight of birds. If the gods said he was guilty, that was it. No appeals, no second chances. His punishment, maybe a public whipping, wasn't meant to reform, but to pound order back into the world, right in front of everyone. To modernize, this system seems harsh, even bizarre, but for Egyptians, it was the only way to keep the universe from falling apart. Every crime was a cosmic risk, every punishment a way to set things right. And when it came time for justice, mercy wasn't the point. The real question was, how quickly could order be restored? That urgency shaped everything about what happened next.
Sire, he must die.
Forget jury trials. Egyptian courts weren't about fairness or defense attorneys. They had one goal: get a confession, fast. Picture a cramped room with a handful of village elders or temple priests sitting in judgment. No lawyers, no legal teams, just you, your accuser, and a panel that already figured you were guilty. Trials moved quickly, and the only thing that really mattered was how soon you admitted what they wanted to hear. Workers' village papyri from places like Deir el-Medina make it clear. Forced confessions were the rule, not the exception. Out of 40 surviving case records, 35 end with the phrase, "he admitted his wrongdoing." No debates, no evidence, just confessions, usually after a bit of persuasion. The idea wasn't to be cruel, it was to jumpstart the truth, and everyone, even kids, learned early that the judge's rod made that happen. The methods were simple and brutal. They used reed canes and stress positions. Beatings and sleep deprivation were routine truth-finding tools. For small crimes, guards might just smack your feet or palms until you broke. If you were caught robbing a tomb or stealing from a temple, things got worse. Suspects might be tied up in awkward positions overnight or kept awake until they cracked. One record describes a man suspended by his wrists for 2 days before he finally confessed to stealing copper tools. The trial process itself was shockingly direct. The accuser stated the crime. The accused either confessed right away or got help remembering. No character witnesses, no closing arguments. If the judges felt generous, they might check with a local oracle or priest looking for a sign from the gods. But usually, trials skipped evidence. When you confessed under pain, they recorded it and moved on. Justice in Egypt wasn't about proving innocence. It was about making sure the rules stayed unbroken and everyone saw what happened to rule breakers. High-profile cases sometimes turned into public events with viziers or governors presiding in temple courtyards and punishments handed out in front of a crowd. A merchant caught selling fake amulets might be flogged in front of his customers before paying a fine. The point wasn't just to punish, it was to make an example. And if you think being innocent helped, think again. One worker was accused of stealing grain even though neighbors vouched for him. The court still ruled him guilty, saying his heart was heavy with deceit. Basically, he looked nervous, so that was enough. He lost 2 fingers as punishment. This system lasted for centuries, not because it was fair, but because it worked for what Egyptians wanted: control and restored order. Suffering was supposed to reveal the truth, so pain became proof. If you confessed after a beating, you were guilty. If you didn't, you must be especially dangerous. Trials weren't about evidence. They were rituals to restore Maat, and confessions were the sacrifice. But sometimes, even the most brutal methods couldn't settle a case. That's when the Egyptians turned to a higher power for answers. When brute force couldn't get a confession, Egyptians switched to something they trusted even more: divine lie detectors. Forget polygraphs or DNA evidence. Your guilt or innocence might hinge on a statue's movement or a priest's dream. The gods, not people, had the final say. Take the case of Nakht, a farmer accused of stealing his neighbor's goat around 1200 BCE. Denying everything didn't help. The priests brought out the statue of Amun, carried it through the village, and asked for a sign. When Amun's statue leaned toward Nakht's house, villagers took it as divine proof, and Nakht got 50 lashes plus 2 goats returned. No one questioned the result. If the gods pointed at you, it was over. Dreams were another favorite tool. Locked overnight in a shrine, suspects were told to receive a dream that would reveal the truth. One scribe lost his job and had his ears pierced with hot awls after he described a dream about mice eating grain. Mice were a symbol of thieves, and that was all the evidence the court needed. There was no weighing of facts, just the right vision at the right time. Oracles made the process even more dramatic. During big trials, priests would carry a god statue between the accused and the accuser. If the statue stepped forward, you were innocent. If it stepped back, you were guilty. Records from Deir el-Medina show a 100% conviction rate when the oracle was involved. No one argued when the gods had spoken, even if later evidence suggested the wrong person was punished. Sacred animals sometimes played a part too. Geese and cats served as living lie detectors. The accused might scatter grain for a temple goose and wait to see if it ate, supposedly a sign of innocence. The results were laughably unreliable, but for Egyptians, the ritual mattered more than the outcome. This wasn't just theater. Even children weren't spared. School texts had kids practice writing oracle questions. If it was my brother who broke the jar, may the sacred cat turn left. Real trials used the same yes or no approach. There were no appeals. Once a god's answer was given, that was the end of it. One builder, Kabechnet, was declared guilty by a dream oracle, and his family's protests did nothing. "Would you argue with Amun?" the priest asked. That was the whole system in a nutshell. Archaeologists have dug up hundreds of court records, and the pattern is clear. Divine verdicts almost always sided with the accuser. Whether the gods were truly speaking or the priests were helping things along didn't matter. In a world where law and religion were one and the same, nobody questioned the outcome. Doubting the system wasn't just risky, it was blasphemy. And if you think the trial was bad, wait until you hear what punishments came next. Death wasn't the punishment most Egyptians feared. The real consequences were meant to follow you for the rest of your life and make sure everyone else remembered your mistake. Wep Wawet, caught with one catfish, lost his nose for life. Every time someone looked at him, they saw a living warning: break the rules and you'll wear your crime forever. Mutilation was the go-to penalty for all sorts of offenses. Body part used in a crime was forfeit. Hands for forgery, ears for lying, tongues for gossip. It wasn't just about hurting you, it was about putting your guilt on display. Court papyri from Deir el-Medina mention carpenters losing fingers for shoddy work, not because the furniture collapsed, but because the noble felt insulted. That shortened hand followed the carpenter everywhere, a permanent resume of failure. Forced labor was another common sentence. Tomb walls and stelae brag about convicts sent to the quarries, often dragging their families with them. A stela from the Sinai mines lists workers who came by order of the court, a polite way to say they were sentenced to hard labor. The worst jobs meant hauling stone or digging irrigation trenches in the desert, and many convicts died quickly in those camps. Public humiliation made sure nobody missed the lesson. Some walked naked with shaved heads, others wore their crimes like badges. Moldy bread hung around fraudsters' necks. A merchant caught cheating might be tied to the market gate with a sign listing his offense. These weren't just punishments, they were public performances designed to make sure the whole community got the message. So why not just execute everyone who broke the law? Simple. Dead criminals can't work, and the state needed labor for its endless building projects. Plus, a mutilated person was a walking billboard for the justice system. Executions were saved for crimes that threatened the pharaoh directly, like tomb robbery or rebellion. For everyday offenses, the goal was to keep you alive, suffering, and visible. The system worked. Archaeologists have found that crime rates in workers' villages were astonishingly low, sometimes just a single theft in a decade among hundreds of people. That's not because Egyptians were naturally honest. It's because everyone knew someone missing an ear or limping from a foot whipping. Physical reminders were more effective than any warning. High-status people weren't immune. When a vizier named Pentu was caught taking bribes, they broke his fingers so he could never write again and made him clean temple latrines. A former royal advisor scrubbing toilets sent a clearer message than any execution. Sometimes people even begged for a beating instead of a fine. Temple records show minor offenders asking for lashes because a public beating ended the shame, while a fine could ruin your family. One scribe wrote, "Better the stick than starvation," after choosing 30 lashes over paying a heavy debt. All these punishments had a purpose, to keep order by making sure no one could hide their crimes. But for the Egyptians, there was one penalty that stood above all the rest. It wasn't pain or humiliation, it was the fear of what might happen after you died. Egyptians lived in constant awareness that the worst punishment wasn't what happened to your body, but what happened to your soul. The ultimate threat was being denied a proper burial, a sentence that meant true erasure. This wasn't just missing out on a fancy tomb or a few family prayers. Without mummification, spells, and offerings, your soul starved. Judges weaponized that fear. 20% of serious sentences included no burial clauses. For Egyptians, the afterlife was everything. You spent your whole life preparing, setting aside money for a coffin, collecting amulets, reciting the right spells. If you lost your burial rites, it all went to waste. Court records show that for crimes like tomb robbing, rebellion, or blasphemy, a judge's verdict might read, "Let his body lie in the desert, unwrapped and unblessed." No mummification, no grave goods, no family rituals, just a corpse left for the animals. Take Amenhotep, a worker accused of stealing from a noble's tomb. Instead of a quick execution, the authorities let him die from his wounds, then dumped his body outside the village. Archaeologists found his skeleton years later, no wrappings, no pit, just bones scattered and chewed. His name was even chiseled off family monuments, erasing him from memory. If you didn't get a proper burial, you didn't just miss out on the afterlife, you vanished from history. This wasn't a rare punishment for serious crimes. Papyrus records from the 20th dynasty list groups of officials denied burial after failed plots. Their families weren't even allowed to mourn them. Anyone caught saying prayers or making offerings for these erased criminals could face the same fate. Families turned on offenders to save their own afterlife chances. The law forced everyone to become an enforcer, just to protect their own souls. Egyptians believed that without a preserved body, your soul would wander, lost, and starving. Wall paintings and texts warned about the eaters of the dead, demons waiting to devour souls left unburied. It was a terror that worked better than any prison or public beating. Even the threat of no burial could break the toughest suspect. Legal records mention judges warning, "Your name will perish with your body." That was enough to make people confess or accept hard labor instead. Some families tried to cheat the system, sneaking disgraced relatives into shallow, unmarked graves at night. But without the right spells and ceremonies, those souls were still doomed. The fear of oblivion kept people in line better than any guard or wall. This focus on burial and memory shaped everything about Egyptian justice. The system didn't just punish the body, it controlled the future. But not everyone faced these punishments equally. In a world obsessed with order, your place in society could make all the difference when it came to justice. Justice in ancient Egypt claimed to be universal, but everyone knew the truth. Your status could change everything. If you were a noble or high official, the rules bent around you. If you were a farmer or laborer, you got the full force of the law. For the same crime, one person might pay a fine while another lost a hand. Who you knew and how much you could pay mattered more than what you actually did. Take bribery. Elites didn't just get away with it, they expected it. Court records and papyri mention officials handing over gifts to smooth out legal trouble or make charges vanish. Judges even kept track of these payments in their ledgers, openly noting which cases ended with a gift received. If you were wealthy, you could pay to avoid a whipping, skip mutilation, or erase charges altogether. For a laborer, those amounts could mean years of wages. For an official, it was just the cost of doing business. When high-status people were accused, the process slowed down. Nobles could demand trial by high priests instead of local judges, and everyone knew temple courts dragged their feet. There's a case of a merchant accused of selling fake medicines who delayed his trial for years until witnesses had either died or forgotten what happened. When the trial finally happened, the case was thrown out for lack of evidence. Meanwhile, a scribe caught stealing a copper ring lost 3 fingers and had to wear the ring around his neck for a month. Women faced the same double standard. High-status women got hush money deals, peasants faced public floggings and divorce. The law might have looked the same on paper, but in practice, your connections decided your fate. Even fallen elites weren't immune forever. If you lost political favor, punishment could be brutal. Everyone recognized the system was rigged. There's a diary from a peasant named Konsu who wrote, "The law is sharp for those who cannot oil its edge." He still paid his taxes on time because what choice did he have? The rules were clear, justice was for sale, and most people couldn't afford it. But if you were at the very bottom, if you were a slave or a woman, the law didn't just tilt against you. It assumed you were guilty before you even opened your mouth. For slaves and women in ancient Egypt, the legal system was more than just unfair. It was built to keep them silent and powerless. Slaves couldn't testify in court unless they'd first been beaten, and women needed a male to speak for them, no matter how obvious the truth was. The rules weren't just stacked against them, they were written to make sure they stayed at the bottom. Slaves only told the truth after beatings. One named Ipi bore scars as proof. His case, scratched onto a pottery shard from Deir el-Medina, spells it out. The judges tied him up and whipped him until he confirmed his owner's story, even though Ipi hadn't seen the crime. The official line, "A slave's truth comes only through his wounds." That wasn't just a saying, it was policy. Archaeologists have found plenty of skeletons from work camps and quarries with healed fractures and scars, proof that pain was a regular part of slave life. One papyrus from Memphis tells of a widow accused of selling bad grain. She brought 5 female neighbors to vouch for her, but the judge dismissed them, saying, "Women's words are like wind." In cases of adultery, the double standard was brutal. A married woman accused of cheating might be forced to swear innocence while holding a hot coal. Drop it, and that was a confession. The penalty, flogging and public disgrace. Meanwhile, the man involved usually paid a fine and walked away. Even pregnant women weren't spared from lashings. The law didn't care about circumstances. Punishment came first, and if a woman tried to bring a case herself, she had to get creative. Some paid male scribes to file complaints for them since only a man's voice counted in court. It was an expensive workaround, and even when it worked, the woman often lost a big chunk of whatever she won to the man who spoke for her. The few rights women had, like the ability to divorce, were mostly theoretical. Court records show that when women tried to leave abusive husbands, judges often ruled they could go, but only if they gave up their dowry and children. Most stayed because the price of freedom was too high. Training texts for new officials didn't even try to hide the bias. They advised, "When judging women and slaves, let the rod speak first." Another line reads, "A woman's denial proves her guilt." The message was clear. If you were powerless, justice wasn't just hard to get, it was almost impossible. But the story doesn't end with the verdict. In ancient Egypt, the real lesson came after the sentence, when justice was carried out for everyone to see. Punishments in ancient Egypt weren't just about pain, they were public theater. Every sentence became a show, and everyone was expected to watch. Thieves tied for days at temple gates drew crowds before impalement. Punishment as public theater. The message was clear. If you broke the rules, everyone would see exactly what happened to you. A court record from Thebes describes a condemned thief forced to march through the marketplace, stolen goods hanging around his neck, before he was finally executed in front of a crowd that had spent hours watching him suffer. Whippings were just as public. Village squares had permanent whipping posts, and market days became the perfect time for officials to drag out offenders. One worker, Pacer, wrote about watching his neighbor get 100 lashes for stealing bread. The vizier counted aloud while the crowd cheered at each stroke. Even children were brought to watch. The lesson was for everyone, not just the person on the receiving end of the punishment. Major crimes meant even bigger spectacles. When tomb robbers were caught in the Valley of the Kings, the authorities didn't just punish them, they paraded the robbers through every major city along the Nile. By the time the execution finally happened, the crowd had swelled, and the entire region had heard the story. Whether it was a slow, brutal execution or a public flogging, the goal was always the same. Let as many people as possible witness what happened to those who crossed the line. The humiliation didn't stop with commoners. High-status criminals got their own special brand of public shame. A vizier caught taking bribes was made to wear a donkey collar and crawl through the streets while servants pelted him with rotten fruit. The donkey, a symbol of chaos, turned the punishment into a spiritual insult as well as a social one. Wall paintings show disgraced officials crawling past their former staff, forced to beg for forgiveness in front of everyone they once commanded. Some punishments became regular events. The Ostracon of the whippings lists laborers flogged on a schedule, so all may see and remember. Unlike modern prisons hidden from view, Egyptian justice was out in the open, woven into daily life. Kids grew up seeing mutilated criminals at market stalls, a constant reminder of what could happen if you stepped out of line. The psychological impact was no accident. Officials even placed torture devices near busy wells so that everyone fetching water would hear the screams. Workers at Deir el-Medina wrote about punishment sessions echoing across the village at night, with parents telling their children, "Listen and remember." Bodies of executed criminals were left on display, sometimes for weeks, making sure the warning stuck. Historians believe these public punishments drastically cut repeat offenses. The threat wasn't just the pain, it was knowing your suffering would become the next lesson for your neighbors. They built a society of watchers, all fearing the next spectacle. In a world where everyone was expected to witness and remember, the fear didn't end when the spectacle was over. It seeped into daily life, shaping how people spoke, acted, and even thought about each other. Everyday life in ancient Egypt meant watching your words and your back. The paranoia wasn't just a side effect, it was the system. Imagine knowing that a neighbor's offhand comment could land you in trouble. People learned quickly that the real danger wasn't always the officials or priests, but the person next door who might be listening for a slip-up. Take the story of Kassa, a potter in Thebes. At a beer house, he muttered that tax collectors grab like vultures. A fellow drinker turned him in, and soon Kassa was tied to the temple gate with his lips sewn shut for wicked speech. The informant walked away with a reward: 5 loaves and a jug of beer. Even if you didn't know Kassa by name, you knew someone like him. Court records show that about 1 in 10 cases started with neighbors reporting each other, usually for a reward of food or drink. Complaints about taxes or bosses could mean lashes or nose removal. There was no free speech. A papyrus from Memphis lists 30 lashes for a first offense and nose removal for repeat grumblers. Archaeologists have found pottery shards with messages that were smashed right after writing. One reads, "If the scribe hears this, I am dead." People were so afraid of being overheard that they destroyed their own words. Social pressure didn't stop at the front door. Families turned on each other to stay safe. School texts praised children for reporting parents, and wives could be beaten for not exposing a husband's rebellious dreams. The expectation was clear. If you didn't report, you were as guilty as the person who broke the rule. People got creative just to survive. They invented euphemisms for dangerous topics, calling the pharaoh the big boat or taxes the flood. Everyone had to find ways to talk around the truth, never knowing who might be listening or who might decide to report them next. Temple oracles only made things worse. Anyone could submit a name for divine judgment, and priests would announce guilt based on a dream or an animal's behavior. A stela from Abydos lists men condemned this way for everything from theft to looking at someone the wrong way. No trial, just sudden punishment, and no chance to defend yourself. Even the wealthy felt the pressure. Some nobles hired food tasters, not for poison, but to make sure no one slipped confession-inducing drugs into their meals. Others paid servants to act as witnesses, ready to vouch for their innocence if accused. No one was above suspicion. People sometimes tried to use the system for their own gain. Merchants accused rivals of blasphemy to get rid of competition, but it could backfire. One merchant, Harkhuf, lost his tongue after his targets banded together and accused him in return. Justice was quick, and second chances were rare. The toll was real. Medical papyri describe fear sickness, anxiety, sleeplessness, and constant dread. One doctor prescribed poppy juice for a man who heard accusers in every sound. The threat of being accused, not the punishment itself, kept most people in line. In ancient Egypt, your own neighbor was your biggest threat. Fear drove obedience more than laws. And if you think that's just ancient history, consider what really hid behind those calm stone faces you see in museums. Egypt's justice was a show of power, not a search for truth. No lawyers, no appeals, just gods, rods, and fear. Confessions were beaten out of workers, neighbors betrayed each other for bread, and families disowned relatives to protect themselves. Fairness wasn't the goal, obedience was. Think modern courts are tough? At least you don't have to worry about your neighbor turning you in for a loaf of bread or being punished based on a priest's dream. Would you trade our messy justice for ancient Egypt's divine terror? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. And next time you complain about jury duty, remember, it beats having your nose cut off for gossiping. Be glad your timeline's not 1200 BCE.